What if I told you that the world's most iconic civilization, Egypt, was not just a land of pharaohs, but also a powerful force controlling the lifeblood of Africa itself? The Nile River. The true history of ancient Egypt is far richer and more complex than we've been taught. For centuries, Western history books have depicted Egypt as a Middle Eastern or even European civilization. But the reality is much different. Egypt's roots trace deep into the heart of Africa, with its people, culture, and knowledge stemming from the continent itself. Egypt's founders were African, and they built a civilization that influenced the entire world. The iconic pyramids, temples, and artworks that remain today are not just a testament to architectural genius, but also to a rich, complex African heritage that has been overshadowed for too long. The Nile Valley was home to the first great African civilization, the Egyptian Empire, and it was here that some of the earliest advancements in writing, mathematics, and astronomy took place by people who were distinctly African. It is critical to recognize the true African identity of Egypt to understand its deep connection to the entire African continent. The Nile River was the foundation of everything in Egypt, an unbroken source of life that sustained the civilization for thousands of years. Flowing northward for over 4,000 miles, the Nile is the longest river in the world, providing water, food, and fertile land to Egypt and the surrounding region. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. The civilization would not have survived in such a harsh environment without this river, which allowed agriculture to thrive in an otherwise desert landscape. Each year, the Nile would flood its banks, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the valley, making the soil fertile for crops like wheat, barley, and flax. This regular flooding allowed the Egyptians to grow food in abundance, supporting their growing population. But the Nile was more than just a river. It was a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. The Egyptians saw the river as a living entity, with the goddess Hapi personifying the floodwaters that nourished their land. It was considered a divine gift, and the entire society, from farmers to pharaohs, was built around its cycles. Egypt didn't just rely on the Nile, it harnessed its power to control and shape the surrounding regions. The ancient Egyptians were not passive in their relationship with the river. They understood its immense strategic value. By controlling the Nile, Egypt could dominate neighboring territories, secure its borders, and regulate trade. The Nile, with its vast network of tributaries, allowed Egypt to control not only the flow of water, but also the passage of goods, people, and armies across Africa and the Middle East. The river provided Egypt with a clear advantage in terms of communication and military logistics, enabling rapid deployment of forces. Egypt's control over the Nile meant it could regulate access to water, a valuable resource in the ancient world, ensuring that it could outlast its rivals and expand its influence across Africa. This strategic advantage made Egypt the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, feared and respected by neighboring empires. Egypt's power was not just a result of its control over the Nile, but also due to its cultural and political connections across the African continent. Egypt did not operate in isolation. It had strong political, military, and economic ties to the African regions south of its borders, particularly Nubia, which was often referred to as the Land of Gold. The two civilizations had a shared history, marked by both cooperation and conflict. Trade routes connected Egypt to sub-Saharan Africa, allowing the exchange of gold, ivory, ebony, and other valuable resources. But Egypt wasn't just a trade hub. It was also a center of learning, with scholars from across Africa flocking to the Nile Valley to study mathematics, medicine, engineering, and philosophy. Ancient Egypt was a cultural beacon for Africa, influencing not only its neighbors, but also the Mediterranean world. Its advancements in science and technology would eventually lay the groundwork for the development of ancient Greece, Rome, and other empires that would follow. Egypt was the African heartland from which the pulse of civilization spread outward. The most powerful rulers of Egypt were not only Africans, they were black Africans from the region of Nubia. When you think of pharaohs, names like Tutankhamun or Ramses often come to mind. But what many fail to realize is that some of Egypt's most influential pharaohs were from Nubia, a region to the south of Egypt, now modern-day Sudan. The 25th dynasty, also known as the Nubian dynasty, was founded by Piye, a powerful Nubian king who conquered Egypt and restored its greatness. His successors, such as Taharqa and Shabaka, continued to rule Egypt for nearly a century, ushering in a golden age of cultural revival and military conquest. These black pharaohs of Nubia not only ruled Egypt, they revitalized its culture, rebuilt its temples, and extended Egypt's influence to the farthest reaches of Africa. The Nubian pharaohs embodied the African legacy of Egypt, and their rule marked a time of great achievement and prosperity. Egypt's military might was as strategic as its control over the Nile, enabling it to maintain dominance over vast territories. To control such a vital resource like the Nile, Egypt needed a formidable military force, and it had one. The Egyptians built a sophisticated military machine, including chariot forces and elite infantry, capable of defending the river and expanding its borders. Egypt's military was organized, efficient, and strategically positioned along key points of the Nile, giving them an advantage in warfare. The famous Egyptian chariot was a symbol of their superiority, used to conquer rival kingdoms in Nubia, Syria, and Palestine. The Egyptians also utilized their control of the Nile to enhance their military reach. The river provided a vital trade route for transporting goods, soldiers, and weapons. By controlling the Nile, Egypt controlled the flow of war and diplomacy in the ancient world. Even after centuries of conquest and colonization, Egypt's Black African culture continues to resonate across the world today. Egypt's ancient civilization left a profound imprint on the world, influencing not only Africa but also Europe and the Middle East. From its advanced systems of governance to its religious beliefs, Egypt was the bedrock upon which much of the modern world was built. Its monumental architecture, including the Great Pyramid of Giza and the temples at Karnak, continues to awe and inspire millions. The pyramids, in particular, stand as a testament to Egypt's engineering genius and its deep connection to African heritage. Egypt's Black African culture, from its language to its art, philosophy, and religious practices, remains a core part of its identity. Today, Egypt's African roots continue to shape its cultural and political landscape despite centuries of colonial attempts to erase that identity. The history of Egypt has often been distorted, leading to the erasure of its African origins from the mainstream narrative. For much of modern history, Egypt has been presented as a civilization that is separate from Africa, often depicted with lighter-skinned rulers in films, books, and artwork. This racial distortion has resulted in a loss of connection between Egypt and the broader African heritage. The erasure of Egypt's African identity was not accidental. Colonial powers sought to downplay Egypt's African roots to justify their own imperialism and control over African land and resources. By distancing Egypt from Africa, they were able to reinforce the notion that Africa had no advanced civilizations of its own. But this narrative is now being challenged by scholars, archaeologists, and historians who are working to uncover the true African identity of Egypt. From the unearthing of statues depicting pharaohs with African features to the rediscovery of ancient African texts, the true history of Egypt is finally being told. The Nile's importance hasn't diminished over time. It continues to be a source of tension and political conflict in the modern world. In the 21st century, Egypt's reliance on the Nile for water remains as crucial as it was in antiquity. But today, Egypt faces a growing challenge from neighboring countries that share the river's waters, particularly Ethiopia and Sudan. Ethiopia has built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, on the Blue Nile, which threatens to reduce Egypt's control over the river's water. This has led to a tense standoff between Egypt and Ethiopia, with both nations vying for control over the Nile's resources. The Nile remains a critical resource not only for Egypt's agriculture but also for its very survival. As populations grow and water scarcity becomes a pressing issue, the competition for control over the Nile will only intensify, making it more important than ever to recognize the geopolitical significance of this river. The future of Egypt and the Nile is inextricably linked, and its legacy will continue to shape the region for centuries to come. As Egypt enters the future, its relationship with the Nile will remain central to its political, economic, and cultural identity. The river continues to shape everything from agriculture to industry and beyond. However, the future of the Nile will require cooperation between Egypt and its neighboring nations to ensure sustainable water usage for all. The challenges that lie ahead will test Egypt's leadership and its ability to navigate complex regional dynamics. What is certain is that Egypt's connection to the Nile will continue to define its destiny, just as it has for thousands of years. The river, the civilization, and the people who have thrived along its banks will always be inseparable, their fate flowing together as one. Egypt's history is a rich tapestry of triumphs, struggles, and identity woven together by the power of the Nile. And as the river flows, so too does the legacy of Egypt's Black African roots and the control that shaped its empire. The story of Egypt is still unfolding, and the Nile will continue to flow through history, guiding its destiny,